Hi, welcome to the Communitarian Podcast. The aim of such a project is to explore and examine the philosophy of communitarianism, the central premise being the emphasis of the community as opposed to the individual. Unsurprisingly, such a broad philosophy can be found to be part of the subject matter of religion, science, and politics, and much more besides. Therefore, in no particular order, I will explore such ideas. Thanks for listening, and leave your comments below. Part 4. How does this relate to anarchism? Until now, there has been no mention of anarchism as understood as a political philosophy. This may seem odd, since this is what Kropotkin is most famous for. However, as will hopefully be made clear, there is a surprisingly concise explanation which links together the current line of inquiry and anarchism in general. This will be divided into two broad themes: Anarchism, the scientific project, and Anarchism facilitates moral progress. Number 1. Anarchism, the scientific project. Kropotkin explains that ever since the 19th century, anarchism has shared the same inductive method as the natural sciences. How is this the case? Anarchism, as an academic movement, was born in the Enlightenment and is essentially a rationalist endeavour. At its heart, it asks a simple question: can the subject being discussed be rationally justified without relying on superstition, ignorance, prejudice, or illogical claims? Or as Kropotkin puts it with more gusto, quote, "Anarchist philosophy, to bend the knee to no authority whatsoever, however respected, to accept no principle, as long as it is unestablished by reason." End of quote. It is fair to question how such a philosophy can share the same scientific method as the natural sciences. In fact, Kropotkin did not give sufficient credence to the empirical limitations and uncertainties implicit within political science. However, he alludes to the fact that we have no alternative but to pursue the scientific method as far as possible within the political sphere. He considers the method of reductionism, the practice of reducing everything down to its irreducible parts, to have been incredibly important. Interestingly, such a method has fundamentally changed our understanding of politics. For instance, we should move away from the studies of kingdoms to instead the study of individuals. It is only by breaking society down to its most indivisible parts that we can gain the most accurate and well-defined criteria for its examination. What are the indivisible criteria of understanding society from the perspective of its individual actors? Quote, "Adaptation of all individuals of the species to the best conditions for the survival of the species, as well as for the greatest sum of life and happiness for each and all." End of quote. Therefore, progress in such a science can only be measured in comparison to such a requirement. Within anarchist thought, equality is a central tenet of a just society. For instance, clearly the system of feudalism would fall short of such a requirement and therefore be rightly judged as unjust system of government. Kropotkin stresses the point that although anarchism is an academic project based in rationalism, it does not originate from a scientific or academic discussions. Instead, it has been developed and articulated within the lives of ordinary people. Number 2. Anarchism facilitates moral progress. As has already been explained, moral sentiments and feelings have been developed within us throughout our evolutionary history. Therefore, it is uncontroversial to conclude that its purest expression and refinement is a matter of mass reflection and participation. This is a key concept of anarchist thought, which was first articulated by William Godwin. Society should not restrict the individual's ability to cultivate their own moral capacities. It is a declaration of the necessity of the freedom of thought. Quote, "Ethics does not trace a stiff line of conduct, because it is the individual himself who must weigh the relative value of the different motives afflicting him." End of quote. This begs the question, how else could moral progress be achieved? The only alternative is to suggest that moral progress is predicted on a rigid stature of moral laws which only require blind obedience. Kropotkin rightly identifies that as soon as an institution or an authority reaches the status of a moral gatekeeper, moral progress is subjected to corruption and degradation. We can broadly categorize this in two ways: manipulation of private interests and arbitrary divisions. Manipulation of private interests. To demonstrate this, Kropotkin considers one of the 10 Commandments. Quote, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's wife, his slave, nor his ass." End of quote. The Christian commandments supposedly represent the pinnacle of moral perfection. However, Kropotkin rightly points out that such a law single-handedly legitimizes slavery and puts women on the same basis as a slave or an animal. The key question is in whose private interest was it to frame such a moral law in such a way? Kropotkin concludes that codified moral values tend to be corrupted in such a way. Quote, "While they always strove, on their side, to turn to their advantage the common law institutions that had been worked out by the masses for their mutual protection." End of quote. Arbitrary distinctions. As a generalization, many of the world's religions appeal to the brotherhood of man. However, often religion is expressed as a divisive way of distinguishing us from them. Therefore, it should be of no surprise that religion has bared witness to some of the most ferocious animosity between groups, whilst aspiring to believe in their supposed brotherhood of man. The observation of such contradictions are articulated brilliantly by Leo Tolstoy's religious essays. Kropotkin does not hold back when he states that, quote, "Inner contradictions is the death sentence of all ethics, and a worm undermining human energy." Religious appeal. There is a common temptation to argue that a truly rational critique of religious thought must denounce all energies and influences which have attracted individuals to religion in the first place, that religion is equivalent to a slave morality. Kropotkin argues that such a critique is only partially correct. As has already been mentioned, all such religious and legal laws only borrow inspiration from well-established and practiced moral customs. They build upon already accepted consensus of how to behave. For instance, the moral teaching, quote, "Do not unto others that which you would not have others do unto you." It is a mistake to ignore the primary motivation of such a teaching, as it derives its inspiration from our social instincts of fair play and reciprocity. Such a mistake is made by both religious and non-religious thinkers. Quote, "In fact, if religions are still alive, it is because, ignorance apart, they have always appealed to this very devotion and courage." End of quote. As Guyot points out, that our social instincts attract us towards such activity. Quote, "We need to help our fellows, to lend a hand, to coach laboriously, dragged along by humanity. In any case, we buzz around it." End of quote. The failure to fully appreciate the true motivation of religious appeal is to dismiss a very important element of our human condition. Kropotkin argues that this is why so many supposed rational forms of moral philosophy have failed to compete with the rhetoric of major religions. For example, the mere expression of "I am the Lord" provokes an intimate reaction from many which no categorical imperative has come close to. Kropotkin makes an interesting statement about the need for an anarchist ideal which appeals to the same motives. Quote, "He makes them feel what is best in them, and awakens their desire to become better still. He produces in them those very ecstasies which were formerly considered as belonging exclusively to the province of religion." End of quote. Anarchistic moralism. Kropotkin's incredible analysis is that we should appeal to the vivid and inexplicable influences of our social instincts, while simultaneously rejecting religious analysis of such influences. Therefore, he has us walking a precarious line between the requirement of the individual's freedom of thought and also simulate and arouse religious-like ecstasies. This is done by appealing to a moral ideal. Quote, "Yet the main purpose of ethics is not to advise man separately, it is rather to set before them as a whole a higher purpose, an ideal which, better than any advice, would make them act instinctively in the proper direction." What is the proper direction? The answer to this can only be found by appealing to our social instincts. This requires a mass reawakening of individuals' moral sentiments. On one hand, we must encourage acts of love, courage, and self-respect, and on the other, despise moral weakness and cowardice. Quote, "Is it not time to rise in defense of the rights of real men, full of vigor, who is capable of really loving what is worth being loved and hating what deserves hatred? The man who is always ready to fight for an ideal which ennobles his love and justifies his antitheses." End of quote. In due course, this will promote and cultivate moral progress. Quote, "Most powerful in rendering man best fit for life in society, a mere necessity of the individual to enjoy the joys of his brethren, to suffer when some of his brethren are suffering, a habit, a second nature slowly elaborated and perfected by life in society. That is the morality of mankind. That is also the morality of anarchism." End of quote. It is important to reiterate the final sentence, since he often had to explain that such an ideal was a product of a rational human ethics that superseded any political identification. It is for this reason I would brandish him as a moralist. Thanks for listening to this podcast. The final part is part 5, the political ramifications of such a moral philosophy.